the man you've been waiting for. Roger Harrabin, I'm really delighted that Roger's made the time to come and join us today. I feel privileged that we have somebody to speak to us today that was one of the very first early voices in society calling out the changes that were happening in our environment. One of the early environmental journalists, award winner for multiple topics. Roger was also a pioneer and was one of the first voices to talk about climate adoption, a recognition that the train had already left the station and societies would have to change and adapt to the future. And so, you know, I hope that you'll take great pleasure in what Roger tells us, and we'll also have the opportunity using Slido to ask him questions, and we'll have the panel piece. But in the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, Roger Harrabin.
Thank you. Okay, so one of my co-speakers joked earlier on that was how I looked before I started to get climate anxiety. You can see there's something of a difference, is there not? Okay, so I'm Dr. Roger Harrabin. Mysteriously, I got an honorary doctorate for my work, which was a total surprise, but very nice. I did 35 years with the BBC before leaving in July. I was then made, again to my complete astonishment, an honorary fellow of St Catherine's College, Cambridge, until I die. And that means I can take as many people to dinner free of charge, as many days of the week as I want, until I die. Well, obviously, I'm not going to be taking people to dinner after I'm dead. So I've put up some facts and figures on my Twitter account, so if I say things and you say, oh, where's he got that from? I mean, particularly about hydrogen, because I'm going to be talking about hydrogen later on. And if you want to read a bit more about it, you'll find stuff on Twitter. And you'll also, if you haven't signed up to Business Green, actually, quick show of hands, who's on Business Green? Who takes Business Green? Okay, well, let me tell the rest of you, you're really missing something. Business Green is a really brilliant environment service, and the people who are writing on it are really, really first class. So I would urge you to adopt Business Green. And I know this is not a workshop for SMEs, but I've written their Net Zero Guide for SMEs, Guide for SMEs, which will have loads of stuff in, which is relevant across the board. So today I hope I'm going to tell you a bit clearly. I'm going to talk a bit about what you know. There are some people here from really different backgrounds, so I have tried to cover all bases. So a bit of stuff that some people will know, a bit of stuff that some people won't know, and even if you know absolutely everything I say, then hopefully it will galvanize you a bit with emotion, because in recent years I have become increasingly emotional on this issue. And I'm now grateful not to be working for the BBC, because I could never before adopt any emotion, and I always had to suppress that. And we were talking earlier over lunch about the first time I stepped outside the BBC to do a presentation, and somebody in the audience said to me, do you think Labour would be better than the Tories on climate change? And I said, yes. I thought, I just said yes. And then I had this weirdest of feelings. I can't really properly explain it, but it started in my feet, and my feet started to get warm, and then my shins, then my knees, and then up through my hips and into my body, and eventually my whole body was kind of hot and tingling after the release moment from 35 years of having to censor what I say. So today you're not getting a BBC presentation, you're getting a rather more emotionally honest post-BBC presentation, which unfortunately is not very nice. So I hope you don't enjoy it too much. I think you'll always, will they already have had the Slido? You've already got the Slido, so if you've got questions or comments, just chuck them in while we're chatting away. Who's got children in the audience? Anyone aspiring to have children? Anyone with grandchildren? Okay, that's Hazel Harrabin. She's at hospital in Watford at the moment. She has a lung disorder, and she finds it very difficult to deal with pollution and also with hot weather, unfortunately. Whenever I see her, and I've got two other grandchildren as well, this is another one whose father is a bit more shy of publicity. Whenever I see them, I get this really mixed feeling, which is just a surge of joy. You know, we see them maybe once a week, a surge of joy, and then maybe 50% of the time, a feeling in my guts of dismay at the world we are leaving them, because I don't know what it's going to be like when Hazel grows up, and when Hazel's my age. I think she will be living in a severely compromised world. And I think we have to be honest about where we are now. If we had started on this endeavour 35 years ago, then we probably would have managed to, or maybe would have managed to avert dangerous climate change. But we've started too late, and we're still half-hearted, and there are still people pulling in the opposite direction, particularly members of the backbenchers on the Conservative Party, and that means we've left it too late for a stable climate, and you know, we can just hope to make things less bad. So I was asked to do a kind of history of sustainable thinking. I had my first experience when I was in my 20s in Coventry as a junior reporter, and I had a pint or two in a pub called Mar Brown's, the old windmill in Spon Street, and got chatting to a bloke who said he had started a party called the People's Party. Well, that went on to be the Green Party, and I thought his comments were really interesting about, you know, acid rain, about depletion of biodiversity, about the oceans, overfishing, and I went and wrote a full-page feature about him. And then I think the sustainable thoughts got embedded because both of my parents had lived through the war and had gone through that whole frugal stuff about don't throw things away, make do and mend, and also could cope with the idea of rationing. Just imagine how much task would be easier now if people could cope with the idea that anything would be rationed. Right now, politicians tell us that nothing has to be rationed. Everybody can live the same. It's bullshit. We can't all live the same. People don't want to accept it. But anyway, when I joined the BBC, there was nobody reporting on the environment at all. Geoffrey Lean was the environment editor for The Observer, brilliant Geoffrey Lean, the real pioneer. And I started following up some of his stuff, and the producers liked it, and the editors liked it, and then I kind of just became de facto environment correspondent. In the early days, it was a bit kind of up and down, because some of the older hacks were saying to the editor, why are you giving Roger this space to talk about this stuff? I mean, these things aren't real stories. You know, this is not real news. And then suddenly there was an enormous sort of cataclysm when Mrs. Thatcher stood up and made her great environment speech, which we'll get to in a minute. And then suddenly it was, who have we got that knows about this stuff? Oh, Roger, he's the guru on this. So I'd gone from fool to guru in a short space of time. Anyway, that was fine. I've had sort of guru and fool right the way through my career, because the news finds it very difficult to keep on any one topic. You know, the news inherently is new, or needs to appear to be new. And climate change, in particular, is just not new. It just goes incrementally, bit by bit by bit by bit, and we find it really hard to report about it with its proper desserts, I think. Anyway, in terms of business and the environment, in 1992, the Earth Summit in 1992, Bush Sr. promised laws to protect the environment, and although he was an oil man, it was quite surprising. I mean, he signed up to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Business Council for Sustainable Development was formed with the idea of eco-efficiency, which, you know, is still prevalent today, and that council is still going. We might ask how much good it's done. I think undoubtedly it has done good, and then other organisations followed, like the Prince of Wales Corporate Leaders Group and Forum for the Future. I don't know if you know the Prince of Wales Corporate Leaders Group. Jonathan Porritt and others persuaded Prince Charles to front up, or King Charles, Prince Charles, to front up an organisation of business leaders, because the message coming from the oil industry and others was, don't cut these pollution here, because that will have this effect on jobs and this effect on profits. And it was felt that there needed to be an alternative voice on business. So the Prince of Wales gathered together people, they had seminars, and there was a major sort of education program for business leaders. And that allowed them to write a joint report. It was written by a secretariat, but they all signed up, these business leaders, they all signed up to this joint report. which went to the EU. And I remember I interviewed the EU president at the time, and he said this had been absolutely invaluable because all the pressure previously from business was coming from the other side. You know, don't impose emissions cuts on us. Don't take the environment too seriously. Think about jobs and profits and monetary value. But then he said this approach from the Prince of Wales actually gave him a kind of shield, so he could present this as a more even-handed departure. So that was actually, you know, a lot of good was done through that. But of course, you know, historically, we've had the drag back from builders, the oil industry, the car industry, the plastics industry, the farmers, like every industry that's going to be impacted in some way with climate change has been dragging back to a greater or lesser extent. Well, sometimes appearing to be committed, but then when push comes to shove, just backing away. So Shell, for instance, you know, looked like they were going to take a progressive move, but now they've decided to flatline oil, yes, but increase gas. So they're still looking for more gas, even though we have between 5 and 7 times more found than we can possibly afford to burn. So this woman, I did say I would talk about her because people should be reminded of this and go and read it. Right, this extraordinary speech Mrs. Thatcher, of all people, gave to the United Nations in 1989. I've just done a tiny little sub-edited version of it, but you'll kind of get the gist. So, imagine me as Mrs. Thatcher. Hard, I know, but do your best. We're seeing a vast increase in the amount of carbon dioxide reaching the atmosphere. The annual increase is 3 billion tonnes, and half the carbon emitted since the Industrial Revolution still remains in the atmosphere. At the same time as this is happening, we're seeing the destruction on a vast scale of tropical forests. The consequences of this become clearer when one remembers that the tropical forests fix more than 10 times as much carbon as do forests in the temperate zones. The result is that change in future is likely to be more fundamental and more widespread than anything we have known hitherto. Change to the sea around us, change to the atmosphere above, leading in turn to a change in the world's climate, which could alter the way we live in the most fundamental ways of all. We are not the Lord's. We are the Lord's creatures, the trustees of this planet, charged today with preserving life itself, preserving life with all its mystery and its wonder. What an extraordinary speech from a woman who is thought to be a sort of dry right-winger. Well, she was a dry right-winger. That made it even more extraordinary. So what happened? What happened then? Well, it made a splash. The news got bored. Counter-narratives were started. And it kind of washed away. And for the lady herself, well, she started to have problems, cognitive problems. She was got at by Nigel Lawson, who, of course, is a major climate skeptic, and was persuaded to kind of partly rescind this in her autobiography, suggesting that, you know, it had given a gateway to socialists, might lead to socialism if we looked after the environment too much. So there have been ups and downs, clearly, and, you know, some stuff has been done, some good stuff, as well as some bad stuff, and the UK's Climate Change Act, for instance, is a really extraordinary piece of work, and, I mean, people like me never thought it would ever happen that the UK would commit to targets in that way. And I know that even though we're backsliding now on coal and on oil and trying to run fracking if we've got half a chance, that we're still an example for other countries who will look at our legislation and brandish it and say, look, this is what they're doing in the UK. And hopefully, if Labour get elected, and I'm not a Labour supporter, but I am on this, if they get elected, then they will start pushing a dam site harder. And Mrs. Thatcher, by the way, mentioned the annual output of CO2 then that so worried her it was 3 billion tonnes a year. Anybody know the current output? It's 35 billion tonnes a year. So it was 3 billion tonnes that inspired that. And we're on 35 billion tonnes. We must be mad. We really must be mad. We have got, in my opinion, and God knows not my opinion, what does that matter? In the opinion of many scientists, we are starting climate breakdown, or we're into climate breakdown. We've had a temperature rise of 1.1 Celsius since we started mass burning of fossil fuels, just 1.1. And we've got all this, the world's hottest day, followed by the world's hottest day. I mean, that's just like weird. And then we're heading for 3 Celsius. God knows what we're thinking. We can see what 1 Celsius is, and we're heading for 3 Celsius. And I spoke last week to Professor Sir Bob Watson, who is the first chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I said, where do you think we are? And he said, well, we will be very, very lucky if we keep it to less than 2.5. So that's the very best to hope for, that we can keep for 2.5 with this craziness that we've got at the moment. I mean, basically, the world has been roasting from pole to pole. I don't really need to say anything about that. I mean, we couldn't have had that even like 5 years ago. We couldn't have seen that. Don't need to talk, really, do I? Lytton, right, this is what really made me emotional, I think, probably for the first time. Lytton was a small town in Canada. It was a small town in Canada until it got torched to the ground by record heat and a wildfire. And when I saw the numbers coming out of it, I heard on the BBC News one of the reporters in Canada say, oh yes, the temperature in Lytton exceeded the previous record by 5 Celsius, and just went on. 5 Celsius? Now, if you're a meteorologist or, that way inclined, you'd know that records get beaten by 0.1 Celsius or 0.2, or maybe even a big exceedance, 0.3 or 4. Maybe. But 5 full degrees, 5 degrees is just ridiculous. Anyway, I phoned up Professor Sir Brian Hoskins. I'm dropping all these names, that's to show I'm terribly important and clever. And said, Brian, have you seen this temperature rise in Lytton? And he said, no, what is it? So I said, well, it's +5. He said, no, it can't be. I said, well, that's what I thought. So I phoned the Met Office, and I can assure you it's +5. Anyway, what was really telling was the pause at the end of the line. A long pause, 1, 2, 3, and then very sensible, eminent, not hysterical scientists said, oh my God. That was when it really punched in that we are in Weirdsville, really serious Weirdsville. You'll have seen on the news the wildfires in Canada, which are blanking out New York. Still some American Republican senators saying, oh, well, it's because of the brush they left on the ground, which is probably undoubtedly true, but, it's nothing to do with climate change. Nothing to do with climate change. It's a shame. In Siberia, we got wildfires. I mean, the wildfire we had last year year before last, was just absolutely devastating. And remember, whenever there's a wildfire, it's not just that you have all the inconvenience of the wildfire and people fleeing from it and mass effort from fire services. And not only do you torch the ground as it stands and kill all the trees, which were helping soak up the CO2, but the burning itself puts CO2 into the atmosphere. And not many people count this into the equation. But in Canada, the current and recent burning is assumed to have put in about 90% worth of Canada's total fossil fuel emissions have gone through the wildfires. So in other words, by making things worse, we are making things worse. It's a vicious spiral. Then we had the UK record. Now, I went to a talk recently which included a session with Laura Tobin, the very nice ITN meteorologist. And she gave us a little glimpse into the WhatsApp group that all the meteorologists have together, apparently, so they can compare notes. I didn't know anything about this, so it's quite interesting. And she said a couple of weeks before last year's record temperature, there'd been kind of a whisper on the WhatsApp group about, well, maybe it looks like it could be getting into the upper 30s by next week or a fortnight's time. And a lot of people were quite skeptical. And then the nearer it got to the time, the more they were certain that it was going to be in the upper 30s. And they were all kind of really bracing themselves because the previous record was 38.7 from what I remember. So they're thinking it would possibly exceed that. And then the day before, one of the forecasters said, I'm really sorry, but I think we're going to 40. And the other forecasters were, no, this could never happen. This wasn't predicted in the UK until the very earliest 2030. And suddenly here we've got it in 2022. And there we got it. And we got our own wildfires in London. Wildfires in London. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. And, right now, I just took a little look at the USA, Alabama, Arkansas, Arizona, California, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Texas, and more, but I got bored. We are getting bored because the statistics are so relentlessly awful, it's kind of numbing. At least it is for me, and it's nice when it's numbing. Record heat in the Arctic and Antarctic. Well, I've not been to the Antarctic. It's one of the few places on the planet that I haven't been burning up vast air miles. I have been to the Arctic a number of times. I once tried my most stupid piece to camera. Well, actually, there were two really stupid pieces to camera in Greenland when we were trying to work out where to do piece to camera. And there was a kind of a crevasse, not very deep, maybe about 5 feet deep. And over the crevasse, there was an ice overhang. And hanging down from this was this sort of icicle, drip, drip, drip. So I said to my cameraman, why don't I just jump in there and do the piece to camera quickly and then just jump out again? Anyway, the good thing is we didn't have a producer, and the producers are always the people who remind you of the safety guidelines. So we didn't have a producer, so I quickly hopped in. And this thing was just dropping. I said, okay, make it one take. So we did it in one take, drop, drop, drop. And it was brilliant. It had the drop just coming past my face as I was talking. And then I kind of clambered out. And do you know that icicle, really fat spiked icicle, landed exactly where my head was about 3 seconds beforehand. So anyway, that was very stupid, but I tend to be quite reckless. And so we did another one later. And what would we do for our second piece to camera? So I said, well, why don't we do it on an iceberg? So he said, do you think that's safe? And I said, well, the Inuits get on the icebergs to spear the steels, so it must be safe. So he thought about it. He said, okay, fine. And so we went and hired an Inuit boatman. And he said, yeah, my family do this. Don't worry. And he got his boat hook and he pushed the iceberg and it splashed a bit, but he said, I think this one's safe. So then I got up on the iceberg. It was the size of maybe about a tennis court, something like that. And Keith, my dear friend and cameraman, said, hey, how are we going to film it? What are we going to do? So I said, I tell you what, you get in the boat and you go round the iceberg like this, and I'll be in the middle, and I'm standing in the middle going like this, so I'll always be facing the camera. So he said, oh, that sounds great. But I said, look, make sure it's one bloody take, because I'm not doing it more than once. So I stood there, did my piece to camera, all went fantastically well, got back to the shore, high fives, well done, Roger, well done, Keith, perfect professional performance. But when we got back to the hotel to look at it, it was really pathetic, because I'd moved with the camera, there was no fixed point for you to know that I was on an iceberg. It was really disappointing. Anyway, that's a moment of levity. The record heat in the Arctic and Antarctic is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, really bizarre. I met Professor Dame Jane Francis, who heads the British Antarctic Survey, a couple of months ago at an event at the Royal Geographical Society. And I went up and said, look, I'm Roger Harrabin, blah, blah. And she said, yeah, I know who you are. Scary, isn't it? So her first words to me, on just meeting her for the first time, scary, isn't it? They're scared, these scientists. They don't like to say so because it sounds unprofessional. But they are scared. And the IPCC people, if you get them in the bar after they've done their IPCC session, they're all scared. But they can't say so because there's no room in a debate, a scientific debate. There's no room to be scared. Hey-ho. Antarctic areas reached 40 Celsius above normal. That doesn't mean 40 Celsius, but 40 Celsius above normal, which was like minus 25 or something. 40 Celsius higher than normal. Some Arctic regions hit 30 Celsius above the usual levels, and records were hit at both polar regions at the same time, which is unprecedented, and for me, another sign of climate breakdown. We go on, don't we? Ocean heat. It is going to get less unremitting soon, I promise. Ocean heat. Scientists have been amazed and appalled by what's happening in the oceans. They used to think, well, they kind of still do think, that the heat from mankind, and the oceans soak up about 90% of our extra heat that we're creating. And the theory had been, actually, we don't have records of this, but the theory had been that the deep oceans would lock up that heat, and it had come back and bite us in the bum at some times in the future, maybe decades, possibly centuries in the future. And then last week, we have a 4-degree temperature rise around the UK. Yet scientists were just saying, what? This is not just like, oh, we're going to lose some fish. This is another sign of absolutely appalling situation on the climate. Another interesting one. I did an Africa flooding Google. Africa, 2,000 deaths, and countless damage, displacement to homes, crops, misery to people. Angola, Benin, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Congo, Ethiopia, Gabon, Ghana, and I've stopped at G. And got bored again. I mean, what? I'd like to swear, but I'll try not to. My wife told me not to swear. WTF. What is the role for business? Okay, so you heard a little about earlier on about that. The COP process is tortuous, the politicians. Everybody's arguing to do the maximum benefit to their own economy and wanting other people to do the heavy lifting. There are some good things coming out of it, and the progress. There is some progress, but it is tortuously slow. And the planet is moving far faster than the COP process can. And the same for other international talks on the environment. Politics is sticky, and even when you think you've won in politics, something comes and drags it back again. Like, the Conservatives and Labour were both completely committed to net zero by 2050. I think that target's too unambitious, by the way, but that's by the by. They're completely committed to it, and then suddenly a small group of right-wing backbenchers or Brexiters start calling into question about whether we should be doing it. And they start appearing in the media, and their comments get picked up by the Express and the Mail and the Spectator and the Telegraph, and suddenly those papers are suddenly in campaigning mode to try and make the planet even hotter. So you can't ever be sure. But business can, not always, can be swift to change systems and to influence other people and to amplify messages. I think you'll be hearing more of that later. So here's some of the basic stuff. Find your footprint. I mean, again, you'll hear more of that later. If you don't know where your footprint is, then you don't know how much improvement you've made, and that's not a great deal of good. You need a comprehensive assessment from raw material extraction to disposal, and you need to use this information to make your own company priorities. You can go for clean energy, buy it, make it yourself. Solar panels, wind turbines, 10, 15 years ago, they would have been kind of nowhere. They were still heavily supported by government. Now, certainly in a lot of developing countries, solar and wind are the cheapest forms of energy. You guys know that. So, it's there for you to be grabbed if you can find the investment to grab it. And then, this is quite close to my heart, low-carbon materials with smaller environmental footprint. I did a documentary on that, which you might like to see. I'd love you to see it. It's called The Art of Cutting Carbon. And I've been trying for so many years to get across the idea of embodied carbon, the carbon that's embodied in our building fabric and all the things we use, has to be counted as well as the emissions from using that. And it's a very odd documentary where we've commissioned 5 artists to make artworks based on the 5 most polluting materials. So anyway, Google that and have a look. I think it's really interesting. I'm very proud of it. So recycled alternatives. I wrote that, and then I thought maybe bio-biased as well, but that, perhaps we'll talk about that later on in the panel. I realise that I'm using a lot of time. I'm a bit dubious about bio-based materials. I think we're going to be in a rush for all sorts of feedstock, and anyway, we'll talk about that later maybe. Downstream, product innovation, design for energy efficiency, low waste, durability, recyclability. A crucial one, educating consumers about the impact of products insofar as you can without greenwashing. And I know we can't have loads and loads of labels on everything, but whatever you can do would be helpful, along with encouraging sustainable behaviour and providing better information on the product reuse and recycling and disposal. Maybe take-back programs as well. Collaboration downwards. Now, of course, the planet is worth it. When I wrote this net zero guide last year, oh no, it wasn't last year, this year, I found to my astonishment that L'Oreal have a deal with Weller to support hair salons. So they're giving loads and loads of advice, and I think money as well, to hair salons to make hair salons more sustainable. I'd had no idea that L'Oreal were into that, but it kind of shows, the potential of what there might be to have a partnership like that. Soft tech, AI, and the Internet of Things. Now, we have to make quite a big distinction here. There's loads and loads of things that can be done digitally, and they can be done fast. Often they can be done fast and do offer hope for cuts in carbon emissions. There are other things, hard tech, which takes decades to get through the planning and to build and finance. And we're doing well, or quite well, with soft tech, and we're not doing very well with hard tech because it's far more difficult. So IBM uses AI to collect and analyze data on energy and resource optimization. You probably know Amazon uses AI to optimize packaging. And they've done great stuff on that, haven't they? They really, the foldy origami type things are brilliant. That's all from AI, I'm told. Cutting waste, improving energy efficiency, rationalizing transport. I mean, these are kind of basics, Siemens uses AI for smart grids. The Internet of Things is kind of wonderful. I did something years ago about the Hilton Hotel just by Broadcasting House, where they'd got a deal to switch off their air conditioning if there was a high demand on the grid. And they had a not water powered, they had an aircon system that relied on the flow of water. And they could turn off, and I sat there to witness this, they could turn off the electricity supply to cool the water for 2 hours, and the water would hold the cool still circulating around the building, so none of the clients noticed that the power had been turned off. I mean, how simple and brilliant is that? And then I did a report on a firm making tarmac up by Heathrow, where they have tarmac, and I can't remember the numbers here, but let's say, tarmac is soft between, 70 Celsius and 80 Celsius or 90 Celsius or something. But that gives you a lot of leeway. So if you pump up with electricity while it's cheap and from renewables, then you can take it up to your maximum, and then your tarmac will hold that heat. And so then you can turn off, and your tarmac will hold the heat, gradually releasing it until it gets down to a point where it needs to be turned on. I mean, these are brilliant, and they're no-brainer. But even those sort of things, when, you get a cheaper tariff to switch on your washing machine in the afternoon or something, even they've been attacked by some of the papers as a sort of Trojan horse for nanny state in your home and nonsense. Blockchain, I think particularly useful for ESG because it's so difficult to verify anything. I think blockchain could be quite useful, helping transparency, accountability, ethical sourcing, reducing carbon footprint, child labour, human rights, modern slavery, you name it. I think blockchain could be probably really useful. It's being used already and probably could be used maybe a lot more. So what are the targets for the risks for the soft stuff? Well, cyber attacks, obviously, power outages, damage, access to sensitive data are risks. And then AI algorithms can exaggerate inherent biases in, say, training data. So if the data exhibits racial or socioeconomic biases, it can perpetuate the biases during energy distribution or pricing. So people who were badly off before and couldn't afford their electricity bills would be even less likely to, thanks to AI unless it's sorted out. I mean, I don't know how many of you saw the story a few years ago. I think 2019 it was, when Amazon's AI system was found to have downgraded women in recruitment, because Amazon was normally full of men, so it didn't award women the proper scores. And also there's an issue of trust, because I have a friend who's a tech expert who will not have a Google speaker or any sort of smart speaker in his house. And I was in a conversation with my wife the other day over dinner, and the speaker joined in. And I don't think it was a person. I think it was the speaker. And it wasn't stupid either. It was relevant to the conversation. So we are now unplugging ours. Although having said that, if we all had an intelligent fridge, would that be all right? If we could, switch our fridge off for 2 hours in the middle of the night or at cooking time or something? Hard tech. Okay, so this is where things get, in my view, more interesting. Clearly, we're going to have loads more offshore wind. Tor is not putting enough into it yet, but it's coming, and Labour will invest heavily in offshore wind. Onshore wind, I mean, I find this absolutely incredible, and I think it was one of the great scandals when the Conservative Party decided to pander to a few backbenchers in rural constituencies who said, I don't want a windmill near my house. Well, what about those people who have a motorway built near their house or through their house, or HS2 going down the bottom of the garden? Do they have the right to stop the development? No, they don't. Why is it just people who don't like wind farms? And the answer is because they are Tory activists in local constituencies, and I can say that because I don't work for the BBC. Carbon capture and storage, right. I first reported on carbon capture and storage. How long have I got? Am I overrunning? Yes, I'm overrunning, aren't I? I'm overrunning. Okay, I'll be quick. I'll be very quick. Carbon capture and storage, I first reported on about 20 years ago. By then I'd seen 3, and I think now there are 12. It's extremely expensive, and we haven't found a way of making it economic yet, and renewables are proving much cheaper. Hydrogen, I must say this, I have started a hashtag hydrogen hype. I think it's appalling what's happening in the way the hydrogen industry is bombarding the media and politicians who are coming out with, oh, hydrogen's the silver bullet and what have you. It's nonsense. It simply isn't. Climate Change Committee say it'll maybe heat 11% of homes. If you talk to Centrica, they say it'll heat 100% of homes. It's just bullshit, and they're trying to influence the upcoming hydrogen strategy. Right. I really will be very quick now to say this, and I think I'll end on this. It's not just the climate. I mean, plastics, biodiversity, fisheries, agriculture, forever chemicals, water, I forgot to say soils. We are in such a big mess. And you guys somehow have got to find the capacity that while you're trying to tackle climate change, you're also mindful of these issues as well, which are really, really pressing. So I will flip through this because maybe some of it can come up. So this is the problem. There's a book out by a bloke called Simon Sharp called 5 Times Faster. I totally agree with it. We're on the right track. We just have to go 5 times faster. And there's Hazel for you to think about. When you're thinking of these proposals, think of your own kids, or you can think about Hazel if you want. But hopefully you will go out and do stuff, and if you're already doing stuff, do more. Thank you.